Hey team, welcome to my quick and dirty introduction to GraphQL. So what we're going to do is that we're just going to implement a very simple use case with GraphQL. Okay, we're not going to go too deep into the details, but what I want to achieve is that I want to give you just enough that you will be interested in learning this amazing technology for querying APIs, and also to show you that it is very simple and actually very, very easy to learn. All right, so we're gonna get started by first going to Spring Initializer and creating a new Spring Boot project. For this project, we're going to bring 3 dependencies. The first one is going to be web. I'm also going to bring Project Lombok along with Spring Boot Dev Tools. And finally, we are going to also bring Spring Data JPA along with our H2 database. So if you just bear with me for a second and we will have that going. So once again, Spring Web, Project Lombok, Spring Dev Tools, Spring Data JPA, and the H2 database. So now what we're going to do is generate the project, and then we're going to open this project with our IDE. So back to my IDE, I have already opened the project that we just downloaded. And if you're using IntelliJ, you can just go to open and then browse to whatever directory you downloaded that to. Or if you're using SDS or Spring Tool Suite, then you can actually use a similar feature to open this up, right? So the first order of business is make sure that we can run our project with no problems. And as you guys can see, I was able to start it, which is great. Now, the second order of business is to bring 3 additional dependencies that we are going to require in order for us to get going with our GraphQL project. So these are the 3 dependencies that we're going to be bringing in today. So first is GraphQL Spring Boot Starter version 5.0.2, then GraphQL Java Tools, and finally Graphy with an I right here, QL Spring Boot Starter 5.0.2. Okay, and with these 3 libraries, we're going to actually enable GraphQL in our project, and then this is going to allow us to start actually querying the API that we're going to be building together. Now that we have our dependencies in place, we are going to move to the application.properties file. Now in here, we are going to configure a few things. First, we're going to set some parameters up for our H2 database. We're going to enable the console here. Then we're going to set up a path so that we can navigate to the database and actually perform queries. And lastly, we are going to set up a database for us, which we're going to call PPM tool, or personal project management tool. Okay. Now, aside from this, then we're going to bring additional configuration to set the endpoint for GraphQL as well as GraphiQL. And this is actually going to enable us to perform queries to our endpoint. Now, as you guys can see here, I'm also enabling CORS here, or cross-site security, so that we don't have any problems calling our endpoints. Now, make sure before you move on that your application.properties file looks exactly like this. Like I said, I'm not going to go too deep into what's what. For now, what I want to do is actually just give you a very quick and dirty introduction to this and just show you that with just a few steps, we can get this working. Next step that we're going to follow is that we're going to go to our package here, and then we're going to create a new package called entity. Okay. In this package, we're going to create a new class, and we're going to call it project task. Now, this class is going to be the main POJO that we're going to be using for our project. So first, let's use Project Lombok to set it up. So now, through the magic of editing, I have added here the add data annotation from Project Lombok. as well as no arcs constructor, all arcs constructor, the builder, so that we can use the builder pattern here and create some sample data, as well as the entity annotation. Aside from that, we're going to add to our ID the at ID annotation, along with the generated value annotation with the strategy of identity. Now that we have this in place, let's create another package. And we're going to call it repository. Here, we're going to create an interface that we're going to call project task repository. Okay. And here we're going to extend the CRUD repository. And then we're going to pass it, as always, the object that we're using here. Oops, sorry for that. As well as the ID type. Now that we have this in place, let's go ahead and create another package. And I'm going to call it initial data. In this package, we're going to create a class that is going to load our H2 database with sample data every time that we start our application. Now, this is very important because the H2 database wipes out all of the data every time that you stop the application. So this is going to actually help us have some sample data for our testing. All right. So I'm gonna create a class here called initial data load. Okay. And let's actually implement this class. Okay, so now implementing this first, I'm going to give it a configuration annotation. And this is needed, as you should know by now, so that Spring Boot picks this up and loads this in our context every time the Spring Boot application starts. Then we're gonna actually use here command line runner. We're gonna give it a bean annotation. And then I'm gonna call this loaddb. I am going to give it the project task repository parameter. And then I'm just going to do a really quick function here so that we can just create 3 sample project tasks by using the builder pattern. Remember, this is enabled to us because we are given this, Lombok annotation to our Pojo, right? So I'm just going to leave this here so you guys can go ahead and replicate this, and feel free to fill this up with whatever sample data you want. That's fine, so long you have some sample data for us to play around with. Next thing we're going to do is that we're going to start setting up GraphQL. The first step that we're going to take towards this is go here to the resources folder, and in here I'm going to create a new directory called GraphQL. And this is needed so that GraphQL can pick up what we're going to create next, which is pretty much the schema. So we're going to create a new file, and I am going to call this project task GraphQL S. Very important, GraphQL S, or else this might not work, right? So create that, and first we're going to define the object and the attributes. So obviously the type here is project task, which is basically the object that we're going to be querying, and obviously the different attributes that we have already implemented here for project task. And if we put this side by side, let me split to right here and go back here, you guys can see that we're pretty much taking care of everything here. Task name, issue description, issue type, description, status. All right. So now, as you guys can also notice, we are pretty much defining similar types: string, 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 and in this case, this one is ID, which is in caps. Now, the exclamation mark or exclamation point here pretty much dictates that these are required fields. For now, we're gonna leave them all as required. All right, this is very important. Now, the next thing that we want to do is define a query. All right, and for this, we're going to define just one query. In this little project, we're just going to have one query, and it's going to be to find project tasks. So the way you define a query here is basically you give it the name, and then in this case, we're going to actually output a list of project tasks. Reason why we have an array of project task objects, and also I'm putting here this exclamation point here to indicate that this is required, right? So now that we have our schema set up, the main thing that we want to do now in order for this to work is to set up the resolver. So for this, we're going to create a new package here. We're going to call it resolver. And then inside of here, we're going to create a new Java class that we're going to call query. Now, let's implement this together. Here in query, the first thing that we want to do is that we want to implement the GraphQL query resolver. Okay, this is very important, as this is going to allow us then to expose the methods that will allow us to actually, create these queries. So here I'm going to add the Maven dependency. Right? It's coming from this package right here. All right. And that should take care of the issue that we're having right now. Now that we have the dependency, now it's only a matter of importing this. And now we have this going. Next thing we want to do is actually bring the project task repository, which will allow us obviously to interface or interact with our database. And then we're going to inject this via constructor injection method. And the last step that we have here is to actually implement the method that is going to find all the projects. Now here's where things will get interesting. So we have a public iterable type project task, find project tasks. And all it does here, as you know, and once again, if you're here, you have some experience with Spring Boot, you have some experience with JPA, you have some experience using repositories. So if you do, there's nothing new here, all right? We have a method that finds project tasks that returns pretty much the project task repository final. And as we know, this all comes out of the box with Spring Data JPA. So there's absolutely nothing new here. Now, one thing to note, and I'm going to split once again to the right, is that this and this, it's called pretty much the same, right? And it has to match. Why? Let's backtrack to what we have done so far. If we go to application.properties, you will see that we have already enabled an endpoint here called GraphQL. And this is good, all right? Then if we go back here, we have already implemented within GraphQL, obviously the type that we're going to be querying about, and also the query to find all project tasks, which ultimately we have implemented here in this query class that implements the GraphQL query resolver, and key name here, query resolver, that then has the method that will in turn call the repository and find everything for us. So as of right now, we have a functional API that will allow us to query the data that we have in our database. So basically, instead of querying directly to the database, what we're going to be able to do is actually request this data and then start playing around with what we want to see. Now, this is one of the beauties of GraphQL, is that without DTOs, and again, this is just my personal opinion, without having to perhaps go too heavy into DTOs, you guys can actually work on your queries and decide what it is that you want to see. So I'm pretty sure that by now you want me to shut up and just show you. So why don't we do this? So if you don't have it installed, I really recommend that you guys open up Postman, and through Postman, then we're going to start executing the queries against our GraphQL API. One thing that I forgot to do, guys, and this is a mistake on my part, but there's nothing wrong with us making mistakes, is that you need to actually make sure that you annotate this as a component once again, so that when you start your Spring Boot application, it will pick this one up as well. So let's restart our application. So now that our application is running, let's first learn how to start querying our GraphQL API. So the first thing that we want to know is that every time that you're querying a GraphQL API, you have to use post. Very important. It cannot be get, it cannot be put, not for any of the basic CRUD operations that we're gonna be working on later on once I tell you a little bit more about the course that I'm gonna be releasing for this. But for now, just know that you have to make sure that you're using post, okay? Then we're gonna go to localhost, and the URL that we're gonna put here is GraphQL. Now, where's this coming from, Carlos? Very simple. If we go back to application.properties, this is where we enabled this endpoint for GraphQL in our servlet. So this is why we are using that endpoint, all right? Then finally, the query, all right? So for this one, we're only doing one use case, which is actually to query or to find all the projects. So first, here in Postman, you are going to go to the GraphQL option right here. And then you're going to type this JSON. You're going to start with the word query, brackets. Then you're going to actually put here the query that we enabled, find project tasks. All right. And then once again, where is this coming from? Well, very simple. We go to our schema, and then you see that this is the query that we have right here, find project tasks. All right. And then finally, and this is where GraphQL gets really interesting. And if this is your first rodeo with GraphQL, you're going to enjoy this very much. So right now, as you guys can see, I'm getting all the 3 objects that we have in our sample database, and that's perfect, right? Now, let's say that we are creating a dashboard, with React, okay? And that dashboard will list all of the project tasks, okay? And by the way, and just spoiler alert, in my course, we're going to be doing just that. But for now, just take it as a teaser and for you guys to get some context into GraphQL. All right. So let's say that we have a dashboard with all the project tasks, but all we want to show there is just the task name and the ID. There's no reason for us to have the issue type. Maybe we do, but I don't see the reason. Maybe we don't need to have the description there, and maybe we don't need to have the status. Maybe all we need to have is the task name and the status. There's no reason to have all the information, because probably you're gonna want to click on that specific dashboard and then just see more information on the project task. You know, it really depends on the use case, but for now, let's assume that all we need is to have a dashboard that will list out whatever project tasks you have in your account, and we just need 1 or 2 attributes for us to display. Now, if we leave this API raw, and if we were using the conventional method, which would be to have a controller that would return JSON, then if we just do it raw like that, first it will show us all the parameters, whether or not we need them, all right? And obviously there are other more conventional methods of perhaps doing this or fixing this up a little more, which would entail perhaps implementing DTOs. And if you don't know what a DTO is, it's called DTO, like this here on my screen, and it's basically stands for data transfer objects, which is another pattern for the server to perhaps cater to specific needs of the clients, right? But this is the beauty of GraphQL. Here we can skip that and we can just alter the query as we see fit. So imagine that we're using this query just to display a list, a very simplistic list of the tasks that we have there, but we do not need issue type, description, or status. So we can just come here and delete this. Yes, delete these. And then if we send here, you guys are gonna see that we're only getting the ID and the task name. Isn't that cool? If this is your first rodeo with GraphQL, I'm pretty sure that you're like, oh, that looks pretty cool. And yeah, it actually works for anything and everything. Like if we delete the other ones and we just want to see the status, same thing. Same thing if we just want to see bugs. If we just want to see the issue type and the ID to see how many bugs and how many stories we have, that's fair game too, right? So this is the beauty of GraphQL. This is why GraphQL, in my opinion, is the future of APIs, because rather than changing the API, or rather than implementing DTO after DTO after DTOs, GraphQL allows you to just set the queries that you need so that you can actually query your API and just go back and try to find the attributes that you actually need to display at the client. And this is why I love GraphQL so much. As a last stop in our little tutorial here, first I just want to show you the H2 database, just so that you guys know that this data was in fact persisted in our in-memory database, and it's what we're querying right now. And also I wanted to talk to you about GraphiQL. So GraphiQL, now that we have those dependencies that we brought in, GraphiQL allows you to see any queries or any mutators that you might have in your project or in your schema more specifically. So as you guys can see, here's the query that we set up, which is find project tasks. And when we go to project tasks, we can see all the fields that are available for us to query. Also through here, we can go back to Postman and actually borrow the query that we had there. And once again, it's localhost 8080 GraphQL if you are set up exactly as I am. And then from here, you can also perform the same queries. You can also go back to altering your query as you need and whatnot. And once again, you can do it in Postman or you can do it here. The reason why I prefer to do it in Postman is because one thing that I found when I was learning GraphQL is that it takes a little bit to get the hang of this thing. And what I like about Postman is that it allows you to obviously save the queries. As I have many here that I still have to save, but it allows you to save the queries, and that way you can always go back and use it as an example. Also here in GraphQL, you can go to the history and it'll show you the queries that you have performed. But in my humble opinion, I think that Postman is a little cleaner. All right. So team, I really hope that you enjoyed this little tutorial, GraphQL on Spring Boot. Like I said, I'm going to be releasing very soon a project, a very small project, but a really nice project in which we're going to actually implement all CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete with Spring Boot and GraphQL. And then we're going to create a React application that is going to query our backend. And that's going to be a lot of fun. That's going to come in the next few weeks, so stay tuned. I'm probably gonna release the React version of this free tutorial, so you guys kind of have the whole view of what we're trying to do here. If I have enough time, I will do it so that you guys get to play around with this. If you want to read a little bit more about some of the things that we have covered, it never hurts to come here to graphql.org and get a little more acquainted with what are queries, what are mutators, what's a schema and whatnot. Not because we're not going to learn this in our project, but because it is very good for you guys to perhaps come to the course with some context. That always helps. Remember, this is all for you to learn, not for anything else. So guys, it was my absolute pleasure to have shared this few moments with you. I hope that you all are all keeping safe in these uncertain times, and I really look forward to seeing you guys in my course.